Hi guys, so I watch a lot of movies, as I'm sure you're probably all aware, but previously I've never really gotten to talk about every single film that I watch. Obviously I will talk about some of them in videos, but I don't ever talk about everything that I watch, so I thought maybe it would be a good time to do sort of like a film diary sort of series where every month I jump on here and just briefly talk about every film that I've watched over the previous month. I'm not going to talk in depth about any of these films. I'm basically just going to go through everything I've watched over the last month, briefly talk about them, and if I've already talked about them a little bit more in depth, tell you where you can go find that. This is going to be in order from January 1st to January 31st, so let's go. On January 1st I watched two films, the first of which was St. Francis, directed by Alex Thompson. This was a really sweet, funny, heartwarming indie comedy. I talked about it in my Best of 2020 video, so go check that out to hear me talk about it more. But yeah, I highly recommend this film. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. And later that day I rewatched The Elephant Man, directed by David Lynch. David Lynch is probably my favourite director of all time, and The Elephant Man is one of my favourites by him. It's not quite as weird and surreal as some of his other films. It definitely follows a very linear structure, which is strange to him, but it's still very dark and at times depressing, which I think is kind of a signature of a lot of his work. The makeup design's incredible, all the acting is really great. I highly recommend this film if you've not seen it. It's a great place to start if you've never watched any of David Lynch's movies. I'm going to give this one a 10 out of 10, one of my favourite David Lynch movies. Such a great experience. On January 2nd, I started the day off by watching James Acaster's new stand-up special, Cold Lasagna Hate Myself 1999. I'm not going to rate this one because I don't really know how you can rate a stand-up special, but James Acaster is one of the funniest comedians around at the moment, and this new stand-up special was an interesting direction for him, and it makes me want to check out more of his stuff. Since this is a stand-up special, I don't think I'm going to give it a numeric value, but it's still really good and I enjoyed it a lot. The same day I watched Baby Teeth, directed by Shannon Murphy. This is a really heartbreaking and emotional indie drama. I reviewed this also in my Best of 2020 video, so go check that out to hear me talk about it a bit more. I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. On the 3rd I watched Makeup, directed by Claire Oakley. I don't know what it was about this film, but I just really could not get into it. Maybe it's something that I need to go back to and rewatch sometime in the future, but as it stands I just really wasn't into it for one reason or another. I couldn't really work out why that was. I'm gonna give this one a 5 out of 10. Didn't hate it, didn't really like it. I don't know why. On the 4th, I watched The Wolf of Snow Hollow, the new film from Jim Cummings, director of Thunder Road. This is a really funny and exciting comedy horror movie that I highly recommend. This was another one that I reviewed in my Best of 2020 videos, so go check that out to hear me talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, highly recommend this movie. Giving this one an 8 out of 10. On the 5th, I watched Diabolique. This was a very interesting crime noir sort of thing. It reminded me a lot of Alfred Hitchcock's 50s and 40s movies, and I definitely got a lot out of it. It's one of those films I feel like I need to rewatch a couple times to really get everything, but I did enjoy what I watched. I talked about this a lot more in my podcast, The Sunday Movie Marathon, in which we reviewed this and 2 of the upcoming films on this list. But yeah, it's obviously a classic, and I understand why. You can watch it for free on YouTube, so yeah, I definitely recommend checking it out and checking out the podcast where I talk a bit more about it in depth. This one's gonna get a 7 out of 10 from me. The same day I watched Feels Good Man, a new documentary about Pepe the Frog. This is one of the most interesting documentaries I saw all year. I really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. I reviewed this a little bit more on my Best of 2020 video, as I think it was my favourite documentary of the year, but I highly recommend checking it out. If it's more widely available than it is in the UK for some reason at the moment, all you can do is watch it on the Microsoft store. There's like no other way to rent it or buy it at all, so hopefully they put it on more things in the future, but I think in pretty much every other country you can pretty much watch it on any rental buying digital service. I'm going to give this 9 out of 10, the best documentary of the year. On the 6th, I watched Cast Away, directed by Robert Zemeckis. I had watched quite a lot of the film in segments across the years, but I'd never actually watched the entirety of the film, so I was glad I got to watch it. Tom Hanks was really good in it, and I enjoyed the film quite a bit. It wasn't incredible. I definitely prefer Forrest Gump, which Robert Zemeckis and Tom Hanks also worked on together, but for what it is, it's an entertaining movie, another one that I reviewed more in depth on the Sunday Movie Marathon podcast. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. It's pretty good. I liked it. I don't know if I'll watch it again anytime soon. Following this, I watched a film called I'm a Cyborg, But That's Okay, directed by Park Chan-wook. I've been trying to get a lot more into Korean cinema in the last year, and Park Chan-wook is a director that I've been heavily following. I've enjoyed all the films I've seen from him so far, and this one was no exception. This is probably the weirdest and most different film I've seen from him. It's a weird, absurdist, romantic comedy that's very surreal and interesting. I felt like it dragged a little bit in the second act, but overall I thought it was a really warm and wholesome movie that's just very weird. And I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. And after that, I watched Soul, the new Pixar movie, which I absolutely loved. I talk much more in depth on both the Sunday Movie Marathon podcast and my Best of 2020 video. I recommended it on the podcast, and obviously it's high up on my Best of 2020 video. It's the best Pixar film in over a decade, and if you haven't watched it, there's just no reason why you shouldn't go out and check it out. This one's gonna get a 10 out of 10 from me. It is basically a perfect movie. Maybe that rating would go down on a second viewing. I'm definitely still living off the high of watching it for the first time and really loving it, but this is the best Pixar film in a long time. On the 7th, I rewatched Room, directed by Lenny Abrahamson. This is still a very dark and depressing movie, but one that I really, really love. It's one that you really should only watch if you're in the right mindset, because it's a very dark and sad movie. I talked about it more in depth on the Sunday Movie Marathon podcast in the same episode in which we reviewed Diabolique and Cast Away, but yeah, I really love this movie a lot still, and I imagine I'll probably watch it again in the future, maybe when I am in a better headspace. I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. It's a very powerful film. On the 8th, I watched 3 films which ended up being on my Best of 2020 video, so I'll just briefly bring them up and won't really talk much about them. First of them was Last and First Men, directed by Johan Johansson. It's a very strange experience. It's basically just a bunch of shots of architecture with Tilda Swinton narrating, like reading this story. I'm gonna give it an 8. Then I watched Decline, directed by Michael Angelo Covino, and it's one of the funniest and most heartwarming comedies of the year. This one is gonna get an 8 out of 10 from me. It's a really, really funny movie that I cannot recommend enough. And finally, I watched Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, directed by Eliza Hittman, and it is pretty fucking depressing. It's very sad, so yeah, this is another one that you probably should watch only if you're in an okay headspace. This is gonna get an 8 out of 10. On the 9th, I watched the Netflix documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. This is one of the most important documentaries of the year. It basically goes over a huge piece of civil rights history that for some reason is kind of glossed over in the grand scheme of history. It's a very powerful, wholesome and moving documentary that I think everyone should check out. I'd give this a 7 out of 10. And the same day, I watched The Vast of Night, directed by Andrew Patterson, the first Amazon Prime original movie that I've watched, and it was pretty okay. It's very clear that Patterson is heavily inspired by the work of Spielberg, especially films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a very slow but interesting sci-fi movie. I got a lot out of some of it. I do think it's a bit too slow. There are a couple of really, really long moments in the film that are just basically long monologues, and I do think the second one of which especially could have been massively cut down, but for what it is, it's a pretty decent movie. I'm gonna give this one a 6 out of 10. It's pretty decent, but nothing amazing. Over the next 3 days, I watched a lot of films that I missed from 2020 that I wanted to catch up on, as well as rewatched a couple that I really loved. Some of these are on the Best of 2020 video, so I won't really talk about them, but some of them I didn't put on there. So starting on the 10th, the first film I watched was Les Miserables, directed by Laj Lai. Really loved this film. It's a great dark crime thriller about police brutality. It's, yeah, a fun experience for all the family. This one's gonna get an 8 out of 10 from me. Really great movie. Then I rewatched Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire and absolutely loved it. I really liked it the first time, but the second time around it really resonated with me a lot deeper than ever before, and that's why it ended up being number 2 on my best of 2020 video. 10 out of 10. Perfect movie. Then I rewatched Uncut Gems and I didn't like it as much as the first time, I think because the initial shock of everything was so much more impactful, but I still really loved the movie. I'm gonna give this a 9. It's definitely weaker than when I watched it the first time when I gave it a 10 out of 10, but it's still a pretty good movie. And the final film I watched that day was Possessor, the new film from Brandon Cronenberg. There was a lot of ideas that I really liked throughout the film, but I feel like it kind of just didn't reach the potential that it had. It's visually very creative and interesting, but for some reason just kind of a lot of the ideas that Cronenberg is presenting don't really feel that fresh. If he isn't just copying ideas that his father did in previous movies, he's just copying things from other movies. Basically, the film just kind of feels like this violent Lynchian version of Being John Malkovich, and although I did like some of it, I felt like overall it was a pretty mediocre movie at best. I give this a 5 out of 10. Starting the day of the 11th, I watched Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, directed by George C. Wolfe. This has the best Chadwick Boseman performance of his whole career. It was very much a great performance to go out on. It's such a shame that he won't ever be able to top this, but yeah, I really enjoyed this movie and it's worth watching just for Chadwick Boseman and also Viola Davis, who are both incredible in the movie. I give this one a 7 out of 10. It's pretty good. After this, I watched A Son, directed by Chung Mong Hong. Similar to Possessor, there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff going on in this film, but I don't think it comes together all that well. This film kind of feels like it's made up of loads of different short films, and although on their own those pieces are really great, when they're brought together it kind of feels like haphazard. There's a lot of different emotional tones constantly going all over the place, and there's loads of different like genre blending that I don't think works quite that well. It's a film that a lot of people are really enjoying, so I would recommend checking it out because you may get more out of it than I did, but I just couldn't really get into the whole experience, sadly. I'm gonna give this one a 6 out of 10. It's not amazing, I like it, but yeah, it could have been a lot better. After this, I watched System Crasher by Nora Fingscheidt, and this is one of the best films of 2020. I've talked about it in the video, but yeah, really loved this movie. Very emotional, just a all-around great film. I'm gonna give this a 9 out of 10. Incredible film. After this, I watched The Truth, directed by Hirokazu Koreeda. I really loved Koreeda's previous movie Shoplifters, so I was very excited to check out whatever he did next. It was interesting seeing him translate his style into a French movie, and this does feel very French. It's a very slow, broody movie, but it's very powerful and I got a lot out of it. I had to give this a 7 out of 10. And on the 12th, I watched the final 2 films that I wanted to watch for the list, starting off with Color Out of Space, the new Richard Stanley movie. This film is basically worth watching just because Nick Cage goes insane in the film. There are a lot of really great things that I love in the film, a lot of great practical effects and interesting creature designs, but overall it's not very good. The first and third act aren't really very good at all. It's really only the second act which makes the film somewhat worthwhile. Seeing Nick Cage just shout about alpacas and getting attacked by these weird creatures is incredibly entertaining and makes the film somewhat worth watching, but overall I wasn't as big into it as I wanted to be. This one I'm gonna get a 6 out of 10 from me. After that, I watched Kajillionaire, directed by Miranda July. I did enjoy this movie a lot, but I don't think I loved it as much as a lot of other people. It's a very funny and heartwarming movie with some great acting and writing in it. I just didn't really gel with a lot of what they were going for. I kind of gave it such a high rating, less because of my personal enjoyment and more because of I felt the film did deserve that. I don't know what it was with the film, it just didn't quite gel with me personally, but I couldn't deny the film was very well made and featured some great acting. This one I'm gonna get a 6 out of 10 from me. And after that, I watched Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, directed by Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese is a director who is a very male-led director in that most of his films are all about men, with women basically having secondary roles. So it's very interesting to see that early on in his career he made this film about a woman. Ellen Burstyn in the film is absolutely incredible, and she keeps the film constantly engaging. The film is just powerful, funny, emotional, and very beautiful, but it still feels 70s Scorsese. It's still kind of gritty and small, just like what you would expect a 70s era Scorsese film to be. I really loved it, and I'm looking forward to rewatching it in the future. This one's gonna get an 8 out of 10. Incredible Scorsese movie. On the 13th, I watched Batman: The Killing Joke for the Sunday Movie Marathon podcast, and I did not like it. I talked about it more in depth in the podcast, but yeah, the graphic novel is infinitely better than this film. This film sucks. I give it a 4, I guess. After that, I watched Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, directed by George Clooney. I watched this literally just because I wanted to watch the last 2 films written by Charlie Kaufman I hadn't watched, and you really could not tell this is a Charlie Kaufman film at all. If I'd watched the film not knowing it was a Charlie Kaufman film, I would have been absolutely gobsmacked when it got to written by Charlie Kaufman at the end. It is a pretty generic crime drama, reminds me a lot of Catch Me If You Can, except that film is so much better. It's entertaining for what it was, and I did actually really enjoy the first half of the film, but I just didn't really like this movie. This is gonna get a 5 out of 10. Yeah. And I also watched The Hills Have Eyes, directed by Wes Craven. This is one of those horror classic movies that I have never watched, so it was interesting getting to watch it for the first time. I wasn't really massively into it, but I can understand why people like it so much. I am planning on talking about the entire series on a video soon, so maybe next month there will be more of the Hills Have Eyes films coming up on the diary. But for now, I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. On the 14th, I watched The Sacrifice, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. I watched Tarkovsky's film Stalker for the first time back in October, and ever since then I've been really wanting to check out the rest of his filmography, and what better place to start than his very last film, a very dark but poetic film about regret and how people basically just talk rather than acting. It's beautiful in every single way. The writing is incredibly methodical, it's very silent and uses empty space really well, and the film is just generally very bleak and somber, just like Stalker was. It's a very fitting farewell, and I cannot wait to check out the rest of Tarkovsky's other movies. This is also available free on YouTube, so there's no reason why you can't go watch it. This one's gonna get a 9 from me. Maybe on a second viewing it will go up to a 10, because I really love this movie and I definitely do want to rewatch it in the future. On the 15th, I rewatched Wreck, and it's still one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. I don't know what it is about Wreck, but this film just constantly gets under my skin and terrifies me. I'm not even really a fan of found footage or zombies, but for some reason this film fucking frightens me every time. If you live in the UK, then I highly recommend getting the recent Arrow Blu-ray, which is how I watched it. It comes with the original production version of the film, which is like directly taken from the cameras. It's probably the most accurate version of the film that you can watch, as it literally just looks like it's directly from the camera rather than being translated into film. It feels much more real, and it made the experience a lot tenser. That's why I'm gonna get a 9. I think I may have given it a 10 in my original review, but definitely think it's more of a 9 out of 10 movie for me. Maybe even an 8, but yeah, I'll stick to 9. After this, I watched something completely different in every way, The Straight Story, directed by David Lynch. Like I said earlier, David Lynch is possibly my favourite director, and this was one of only 2 films that I had never watched by him. It's a very beautiful movie that just kind of proves how versatile David Lynch can be. It's a shame that he kind of just does nothing but weird, surrealist, out there movies nowadays, because he's an incredibly talented director and he handles heart and the human spirit so well in this movie. It's a very beautiful, heartwarming experience that I cannot recommend enough. I'm gonna give this one a 9 out of 10. Super underrated David Lynch movie. After this, I watched Hiroshima Mon Amour, directed by Alain Resnais. This is basically, not including La Jetée, my first French New Wave film, and I really liked it. It's a very dark but beautiful tale of romance and the impact that past events can have on it. It's really interesting. It's got fantastic writing and directing. The acting is fantastic. Emmanuelle Riva is incredible in the film. I obviously saw her in Amour and she was incredible in that, and she's just as great in this. This actually reminds me a lot of films like the Before trilogy or Certified Copy, and how they're basically just a man and a woman who kind of have a thing that are just walking along a city just talking to each other. It's very interesting. It's obviously a slow burner because it is literally just two characters talking, but I cannot recommend this film enough. It's very obviously very influential. I'm gonna give this one an 8 out of 10. And on the 16th, I watched Stanley Kubrick's version of Lolita. This is one of the only Stanley Kubrick movies I'd never actually watched before, and I definitely thought it was very interesting. It's probably one of my least favorite Stanley Kubrick films, but I do like the way that they tackle these taboo subjects. I can understand why it was so controversial upon release, although by today's standards it is kind of tame. I'm going to be doing a Stanley Kubrick ranked video at some point in the future, so maybe then I'll talk about it a little bit more. But it's not the worst Stanley Kubrick movie, like it's still really good, I just don't think it's that amazing. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. It's kind of like riding the line of a 6 and a 7. I kind of only gave it a 7 because of the historical importance of it. On the 17th, I watched Persepolis, directed by Vincent Paronnaud and Marjane Satrapi. I've been meaning to watch this film for a long time because I really loved the graphic novel that it's based off, and I did love the film quite a lot, although I do still think the graphic novel's a little bit better. The animation style is incredibly creative and I think fits the tone of the graphic novel really well, while doing something quite different and bringing it to life in a really interesting way. The voice acting is really great, at least if you watch the original French version. I started watching it with the English dub because I didn't actually realise it was French, but the English dub, apart from having Gina Rowlands in it, which is pretty cool, is not very good at all. The only problem I have with the film is I don't think it's long enough. There's a lot of story arcs that don't really get focused on that much and don't have the dramatic weight that the book did. I didn't really find myself feeling the same emotions that I felt reading the book, which is a bit of a shame, but still, this is a really great, well-made movie. It's clear that a lot of care and love has been put into this film, and it really shows. I'm gonna give this one an 8 out of 10. After that, I rewatched Boy, directed by Taika Waititi. This is still probably one of my least favourite Taika Waititi films, but I definitely did enjoy it a little bit more than I did the first time. It's very funny, charming, full of heart, it's very well written and directed, the acting is all really good. I love Taika Waititi's character in the film. I think it's probably the best character that I think he's played in a film. There's a lot to really love about this film, and I completely understand why some people would consider this to be a near masterpiece, but personally I wouldn't go that far. I love it still. I think it's a really well made, funny and entertaining movie. I just don't think it's the greatest thing in the world. 8 out of 10. Then I watched a few films for the episode of the Sunday Movie Marathon that came out on the 24th of January. So that started on the 18th with Paprika. I was really looking forward to this film because I love Perfect Blue from Satoshi Kon, the director of Paprika. And yeah, it was a pretty good movie, but I don't really have any clue what happened. Very confusing. I think it's a film you really have to pay super close attention to because there's just so much going on and it's so strange and surreal, but I did really enjoy it, and yeah, I am looking forward to watching the rest of Satoshi Kon's filmography. I'll give this a 6, I guess. I don't know. I wanted to like it more than I did. On the 19th, I watched Eyes Wide Shut, and it is pretty much about as perfect as a film can get. 10 out of 10. Perfect movie. And then finally on the 20th, I rewatched Good Time, directed by the Safdie brothers, and yeah, I love it even more than ever before. This is a 10, alright. On the 21st, I watched 2 films, first of which was a short film directed by Don Hertzfeldt called Rejected. This is basically like Tom Scar's ASDF movies, but by Don Hertzfeldt. It's a very surreal, depressing, but really funny little short. I'm going to give it an 8 Really love this short. Then I rewatched Kung Fu Panda for the first time in over a decade. This is definitely one of DreamWorks' best, but I don't think I'm in love with it as much as other people. It's incredibly well animated, vibrant, entertaining, and there are a lot of laughs. I wouldn't say it's the funniest animated film or even the funniest DreamWorks movie I've seen, but by DreamWorks standards, this is pretty decent. This is going to be a 7 out of 10 for me. It's one of DreamWorks' best, which, considering it's only 7, is saying quite a lot of my opinion on DreamWorks. On the 23rd, I watched Fear and Desire, the first film from Stanley Kubrick. Yeah, this was a very rough one. It seems with a lot of directors, either their first film is a surprisingly really great experience or very amateurish and doesn't really display the full potential that they would develop over the next few films, and Fear and Desire is definitely an example of the latter. Not the best movie in the world, it's quite dull, boring, there's not really a lot going on. Stanley Kubrick himself hated the movie and tried to basically destroy all the prints of the film, and watching it I can definitely understand why. I would recommend watching it just as like a completionist thing. Like, it's interesting seeing that this incredible director would start here at such a low, but otherwise I would not recommend this film to anyone, and I'm giving it a 2 out of 10. I also watched the short film Castello Cavalcanti, directed by Wes Anderson. I will basically watch anything that Wes Anderson does, and although this is like one of his weaker projects, is still a very interesting one. It feels almost like the intro to a longer film, so it's very awkward when it just suddenly ends and nothing's really resolved. But it's interesting, it looks beautiful, and it's got a great performance from Jason Schwartzman, which is probably enough to suck any Wes Anderson fan in. I then watched a few films for the Sunday Movie Marathon podcast, the most recent episode which came out on the 31st of January. Those films were Possum, Filth, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Enter the Void. And also, to prepare for that, in between the films, I watched a couple of other Gaspar Noé films. I'd seen Enter the Void before and absolutely loved it, and I'd also seen Irreversible and Climax, so I thought it was a good excuse to catch up on his filmography and watch everything I hadn't seen, starting with I Stand Alone, which was a pretty interesting movie. The two films I watched, this and Love, are definitely his weakest movies, and I did appreciate this film a lot. I just didn't get super into it. A lot of it did kind of just feel like Gaspar Noé trying to make his own version of Taxi Driver, and although there are a lot of elements that I do like and there's a great performance in there, a lot of it kind of almost felt like edgy for just the sake of being edgy. But what I will say is the last half an hour of the film is super disturbing but incredible. If the entire film was like that last half hour of the film, I would have loved this film, but as it stands, it's a film that I did like. I just was not as in love with it as Irreversible, Enter the Void, or Climax, and I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. And the other one, Love, is definitely by far the weakest movie that he's done. I did appreciate a lot of things about it. I like the way that the film basically delves into the side of romance and love that we don't really see in movies, that secret sexual side of it. Obviously, there's a lot of scenes in the film of the actors having real life unsimulated sex on camera, and I was expecting it just to be like just Gaspar Noé making porn, but surprisingly it was very tastefully done, and I do think those scenes are very important to the overall feel of the film. This is definitely Gaspar's most normal and linear movie, although it does kind of play around with time and go back and forth between the timelines, which I thought was an interesting decision. This is definitely a very realistic depiction on relationships and love, and also what it is to be a man. Watching the film, I definitely felt like shit because I related to the main character more than I wanted to, and I felt like that's kind of the point, but it's quite pretentious, and I don't like saying that about films, but this film is pretty pretentious. There are a lot of moments that feel like Gaspar's just stroking his ego, and it kind of put me off. I did find a lot of it a bit slow, and the film is way too long. You easily could have cut out maybe half an hour of the film, and I think I actually probably would have loved it. But as it stands, this is a pretty decent movie. I did like it. I just don't think this is a great film. And I'm gonna give this one a 6 out of 10. On the 29th, I was incredibly hungover because the 28th was my birthday and I had a lot to drink. So I decided to watch 2 films, the first of which was Magnolia, and my god, this film. I fucking love this film. I watched Magnolia for the first time last year during the first pandemic lockdown, and I really loved it, but my god, a second time around, it just resonates so much deeper. This is my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson movie. I will probably be talking about it more in the future because this is a film that is so deep and so densely packed. There's just so much you can talk about. But what I will say is that if you have 3 hours to spare and you just want to make it go by as quickly as possible, watch Magnolia, because there's something about this film that's so fast-paced and entertaining that there's never a single dull moment, and those 3 hours just absolutely fly by. I'm giving this one a 10 out of 10. This is a perfect movie in my opinion. I also watched John Carpenter's The Fog for the first time in like over a decade, and it was okay. I really love what John Carpenter's going for visually. I think the whole idea of the fog and how these weird creatures are like old pirate zombie things and their eyes glow, I think that stuff is really cool. There's like a lot of neon lights coming through the fog which look incredible, even on the old crappy looking DVD that I was watching the film on. But it's very slow. I don't think it's that scary anymore. I remember finding it a lot scarier when I watched it when I was like 14, 15, and I don't think the music is quite as memorable as some of John Carpenter's other scores. It's definitely one of his weaker earlier movies, but I still do like it. I definitely recommend it if you're a fan of horror, especially like classic 80s horror, because this is a classic for a reason. It may not resonate super deeply with me, but there's a lot I do appreciate about it, and I'm glad I eventually got around to rewatching it. I doubt I'll ever watch it again, but it's a fun movie for what it is, even if it is a little bit slow at times. And I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. Then on the 30th, I watched Robert Altman's Nashville for the first time. I bought this Blu-ray a few years ago on a whim, just looking at the poster on the cover and really thinking it looked interesting. And I did like it. I definitely admit I did not get everything out of the film that I could have done. I think maybe I'm going to have to rewatch it again in the future to really soak it all in, because there's a lot going on. I was still feeling a little bit ill from the previous days, so I don't think that helped the experience, but I definitely did like it quite a lot, and I'm looking forward to rewatching it. Me wanting to rewatch a film is always a good sign, because a lot of the time I just don't. So if I want to rewatch a film, then that's a good thing. I definitely know I missed a lot of this movie, and I think if I give it another chance in the right headspace and frame of mind, I would love this movie a lot more than I did. But as it stands, I'm just going to give it a 7 out of 10, but that's just a rating for now. I'm 100% certain that will change upon the second viewing. And the final film I watched in January was Mystery Train, directed by Jim Jarmusch. I'd previously watched Jim Jarmusch's film Patterson, and I did like it quite a lot, but I wasn't in love with it like a lot of people are. But I've definitely been interested in checking out the rest of his filmography, and since I've been trying to watch some more films with these like interconnected stories, this film seemed perfect. And it was pretty great. It's very well written, it's funny, there's some really great performances all throughout. Steve Buscemi is in it and he's great as always. Joe Strummer from The Clash is also in it, and he's not a very good actor, but he fits the role really well, and the character's really likable. In fact, all the characters are really likable in their own quirky, interesting way. It's a very interesting film, basically just made up of a bunch of different stories that interconnect together. It's a bunch of different weird, kooky characters all basically staying in a hotel, and it basically in a lot of ways serves as a vehicle just to show off how great Jim Jarmusch's writing is. And it works really well. I enjoyed it a lot, and I cannot wait to watch the rest of Jim Jarmusch's filmography, and I'm going to give this one an 8 out of 10. So although that was all the films I watched, I thought I'd briefly talk about a couple of TV shows I watched. It's quite rare for me to watch TV shows nowadays. I mostly just watch like whatever's on TV or just The Simpsons, but I've been trying to get into more TV and I actually watched 2 shows in full this month. First of which was Flight of the Conchords, which I'd never seen before. This is a really great New Zealand comedy show. If you're a fan of Taika Waititi's movies, then I cannot recommend this enough. Taika did direct a couple of episodes, but wasn't involved in the writing at all, but it is still that same sort of dry humour that you'd expect from his stuff. It's of course co-created and starring Jermaine Clement, who Taika did What We Do in the Shadows with. So if you're a fan of his sort of stuff, then you will definitely love this show. In a lot of ways, this reminded me of like The Mighty Boosh, maybe mixed with Peep Show, but not quite as crude as that show. It's very accessible if you're a fan of British humour, because New Zealand and British humour aren't too different. And yeah, I really enjoyed the show. It's only 2 seasons long. I think there's only about 20 episodes in total, so there's no reason why you shouldn't go check it out. And I also rewatched Twin Peaks: The Return, and it is still pretty incredible. I would probably go as far as to say this is my favourite piece of visual media in history. I really love this series. It's funny, it's emotional, it's strange, it's confusing, but there's never a single dull moment, there's never a moment that doesn't feel necessary, and the overarching story and what David Lynch did with it is incredibly well done. Straight after I finished this Return, I actually went back and started rewatching the original series, so who knows, maybe in the future there'll be a couple of videos about the series in full. And that is everything that I watched in January 2021. Thanks for watching this video. I didn't expect it to go on this long, but I guess I watched quite a lot this month. I doubt I'll watch anywhere near this much again for a long time. It was mostly just because I had a lot of films from last year to catch up on before making my best of 2020 video. Let me know your thoughts on the films that I watched, if you have seen any of them, in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.